I am Najwan Berqdar, the Outreach and Communications Team member at Zochrot, and I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight, especially with our very special guest speakers. I must admit I've been quite successful in avoiding any kind of participation in online events other than the few I attended or helped organize, but I definitely was not adapting to this new reality. Yet I must look at the bright side of our virtual engagement and events, which brought us all closer together with other people and movement from across the world, and even here. So as we look forward to the beginning of the new year, which will hopefully manifest a different reality, and despite its challenges, sadness, and loss, it has left us a little hopeful and inspired by the power of the people and by the power of community giving and community solutions. In times of crisis, we have witnessed the true meaning of community in action. We have seen who is suffering the most due to the rooted problems in our unjust colonial systems. But we have also witnessed who is standing for the communities mostly affected. So since our online presence has brought our vision of return closer to the world, we wanted to end this year with a message of hope and a message of solidarity. While solidarity with Palestine is as old as the Nakba, the experience of global solidarity has figured prominently in the past 2 decades in response to the growth of global capitalism and imperialism. The need to confront the systematic violation of people's rights around the world and the powers behind it is leading to the unity of the different movements seeking justice and laying the ground for a collective and mutual learning and strategizing, generating new forms of solidarity. This is why tonight we're coming together to discuss solidarity as a verb, as said by our friend Mark Lamont-Hill, who was fired from the CNN when he boldly expressed his solidarity with Palestine, right after his visits with the delegation to Palestine, and joining a tour with Zochrot to lead. Meeting him and other activists from Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter, and Blacks for Palestine, and other indigenous activists who came to learn about Palestine, taught me a lot about other movements and struggles, but also about mine, and inspire new ways of thinking towards resistance. And tonight we will do exactly that. We will think together, how can solidarity work to become a part of our resistance for the just shared future we wish to be it? Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the great lineup of speakers and friends we have tonight. Friends that I met along the way as part of our efforts to bring our visions together and work closely to fight the systems of oppression accountable for the injustices of the world, including the Palestinians. We will hear from our guests, from them about their different experiences, activism, and commitment for social and racial justice, not only to their people, but to that of all people, and how they view return as an integral part of their commitment and work toward a just and better future for all. We will end the session with a collective radical imagination of the ways to move forward with the global solidarity movement to advance return in its different forms. Joining us tonight, we have Khoury Peterson Smith. He is a Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He is a researcher and activist who focuses on ending the war on terror, the Palestinian freedom struggle, Black internationalism, and solidarity against empire. We also have Orly Noy, who is a journalist, editor at Sihami Kumit, a translator of Farsi literature into Hebrew, and a Mizrahi political activist. We also have Leah Miskin-Pierre, who is a Jewish American Palestine solidarity organizer who believes in creating the world we seek in our own communities. She supports organizing, training, and mentorship in communities across the country to transform power in Congress with the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and works to build a world beyond police and past patriarchy with Occupation Free DC, Collective Action for Safe Spaces, and Lift Wing DC Football Club. We will ask our panelists some questions and we will move to the Q&A. Please write your questions in the box for the Q&A, and if it's addressed to a specific speaker, please write her or his name. I will start with the first question about the importance of solidarity. All of you here are occupiers on indigenous lands with different relationships to power and choice on how you became occupiers, but a shared commitment to dismantling occupiers' privileges and returning land to those indigenous people that colonizers stole it from. How does this solidarity work from the occupier's side, and why do you choose it? Are there any shared visions, benefits, or political analysis, or is it something else? We will start first with Lee.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much, Najwan, for inviting me to this conversation. I think solidarity and growing into it is a constant process, so I'm grateful to learn with you all. I really love this question because I think that I've found that to build trust in doing this work together, we need to be able to share and keep learning. How is this for me, and how is this for my community, and how is this for you and your community all at once, right? So in that way, I think to reject Zionism, to support return, to struggle to build a society based on reparations and repair, that to me is based on my lived reality, because I see Jewish Americans, which is a community I'm part of, and especially white Jewish Americans, kind of the smaller privileged community within that community, that, you know, we need to defend ourselves from anti-Semitism. And we also need to build a community worth being part of. And both of those require rejecting this kind of toxicity that we've adapted by the white among us kind of assimilating into white supremacy. And simultaneously, it's also a political and moral choice, right? It's to say it's an affront to my belief in love and joy and all these things to choose this kind of supremacist logic. So that's a lot of words, and I think it makes more sense in a example, which is people may have heard of the Birthright program. So this is a program that has brought many, I would say maybe hundreds of thousands of American Jews, many of them white and middle class, but not all of them, to Palestine. And here I want to credit the work of, I have a brilliant former Tufts Students for Justice and Palestine comrade, Sophia Goodfriend, who really dissects the way that Zionism has changed U.S. Jewish communities, and also the way that so many Palestinians, and I know Loyola SJP is an example, who staged really powerful protests to kind of display the violence of Birthright. So this is who I'm building from. Birthright is about bringing young Jewish Americans to Palestine to have them have an emotional experience that makes them adopt Zionism as emotionally close to their hearts. But it actually started as a reaction to a fear of U.S. Jewish intermarriage. 1990, the National Jewish Community Survey says 52% of Jews are intermarrying with non-Jews. This is a crisis in the minds of people who only can imagine safety in turning into their community. So they say, Jews are leaving the community, we can't be safe. And they freak out. And one of their solutions is to tie an insistence on Jews sticking with their own to, and in this, I would say coded it was very much like white Jews sticking with other white Jews. And also at the same time, to basically say we will wed Zionism.
Leah, can we ask you to speak slower? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the reminder.
I was going to ask you that before, but I forgot.
No, I appreciate it. As a native English speaker, I want to be heard by everyone. It's my one language, so appreciate y'all. So just to say that what Birthright did was it said we can keep the Jewish community, the white Jewish community, with each other by kind of connecting Zionism to patriarchy, to supremacy, saying that you only should want to marry other white Jewish people, right? So that's what Birthright did. And then the stake in it you see is both that it's just wrong, right? It is wrong to go to another person's land and ride camels and erase their history, all as part of your kind of narrow-minded project to get white Jewish folks sticking with other white Jewish folks. But it's also culturally and personally toxic to Jewish people, right? Birthright, there's a great zine called Whose Birthright, written by Sophia Goodfriend, that talks about this, that in the same way that Zionism was built on these ideas that Jewish men needed to be more manly and violent, today in Birthright you have this kind of gross norms of ogling the soldiers, like being like this toxic masculinity you see from 1900 to 2000 to 2020. And I think that to me is really shows both sides of this, right? That we both want to reject it as simply wrong, to deny other people their homeland and kind of paper over it with your sort of fantasies. But it's also has these extremely negative impacts on the Jewish community in the United States, to kind of choose supremacy over a solidarity with other people. So to me, like, that's just one lens in which we see that if we want a Judaism where our Black and Indigenous and brown members of our community are fully included, where women and non-binary folks are safe, that's going to require rejecting Zionism. And it also builds a world in which we can have joy and love and community with Palestinians. And it starts with reparations, right? It starts with returning the land instead of claiming it.
Yeah. We will move to Orly with the same question.
Yes. Well, first, thank you so much, Najwan, for having me in such an important conversation. Well, as you mentioned, I am a translator, among other things, of Farsi literature into Hebrew. So with your permission, and that's in direct answer to your question, but I would like to start with quoting 4 lines from a beautiful Farsi poem by Ismail Khouri, and I will translate briefly, but it's worth listening to the beautiful sound of the words in Farsi, I think. And the poem says, با یک دل غمگین به جهان شادی نیست، تا یک ده ویران بود آبادی نیست، تا در همه جهان یکی زندان هست، در هیچ کجای عالم آزادی نیست. And I find it to be one of the most beautiful poetic expressions of the meaning of the term solidarity. In a very unelegant translation into English, it would be, there cannot be any joy in the world as long as there is one broken heart. There cannot be any prosperity as long as there is one displaced village. And as long as there is one imprisoned person in the world, anywhere in the world, there is no freedom anywhere else in the world as well. Now, that goes to the very general meaning of solidarity, but now I want to talk about the meaning of solidarity for me personally. I immigrated to Israel at the age of 9 from Iran at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution. It took me many, many years to come to the realization that at the age of 9, before I even set foot in Israel, I already had in it more privileges and more rights than Palestinians who had been living here for many, many generations. It took me even longer time to realize that the source of this unjust reality is the same source of all the discriminations against the Mizrahi population, which is the Jews immigrated to Israel from Arab and Muslim countries, such as myself. And you know, we often speak about that term of solidarity in terms of interconnections between different struggles. I honestly believe that it's this one struggle, it's the same struggle, and that if you go far enough or deep enough, then you understand that different forms of discrimination, of violation of basic human rights, they basically go back to the same, and I'm specifically now speaking about the reality in Palestine, Israel. Of course, the manifestation of that root of injustice is very, very different. And of course, that it's directed first and foremost at the Palestinians, and the mechanism of discrimination was set to discriminate against Palestinians specifically. But as a Mizrahi, I can tell you that almost any part of that institutionalized mechanism of discrimination against Palestinians in some way serve to discriminate against Mizrahim as well. And we don't have time now to go into the many, many examples, but I will give you just one very quick example of those admission committees that now the nation state law also reinforced, Jewish towns or settlements can decide through those committees who they admit in, who they accept to their community, and who they reject. Now, of course, the mechanism was set to begin with to discriminate, to keep the Palestinians out. It's part of the ongoing, endless demographic and geographic war against the Palestinian citizens and residents of the occupied territories. But soon enough, it started serving as a mechanism to discriminate against Mizrahim, because the Palestinians knew that they had no chance to, and they didn't want that much to live among white privileged Ashkenazi Jews anyhow. But so it became to serve as a mechanism of discrimination against the Mizrahim. The same goes with the Arabic language, which was stolen from the Mizrahi communities, their history, their heritage, their culture, etc. So in a sense, solidarity for me is two things, is understanding that the root is one, and understanding my place in that hierarchy of power, understanding that reality can be complicated enough for you to be both a beneficiary of the mechanism of discrimination and racism and supremacy, but at the same time also being a victim of it. And that at some point you need to make a moral choice that it's more important to you, and it's the moral choice to get rid and to let go of the privileges that, and I'll speak about myself, that I enjoy as a Jewish colonial, to become free as a Mizrahi Jew. And I think that this is, for me, the solidarity with the Palestinian cause is my goal as a Mizrahi Jew, to reconnect not as a colonial, but as a native person, as a native inhabitant of the Middle East, not under a the chain that holds the prisoner, also holds the warrant at the other side. It's the same chain. So my understanding of solidarity is to break that chain and free both ends.
Thank you, Orly. That was beautiful. Moving on to Khoury. Do you remember the question?
So, though I'm so moved by what my my co-panelists are saying, that it's easy to forget for a moment. I'll start with gratitude, for being invited to this really already rich conversation. So deep thanks to Zochrot and to Najwan for inviting me, and to Leah and Orly. So, and maybe I'll do something, go kind of in the opposite direction as Orly, and start actually with a word about how I would describe my location and the location of my community of kind of Black America in this bizarre project called the United States, and then in the world, and then move from there to some general points about solidarity for those who are or kind of enlisted in or willingly sign up for an occupying project. So, of course, the position of Black people in this place called the United States is extremely complicated. And I, in some ways we are, of course, integrated or structured into a kind of occupying and settlement architecture. My hope is to be less of an occupier and more of a guest, and in this place of native land, and always a comrade in terms of dismantling that architecture. But there is in fact, a very rich history of joint Black Indigenous revolt against the structure that actually starts from the moment that enslaved Black people were introduced to this place. So even, you know, in the US, you know, I grew up here. I learned that the country begins in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence against the British rule. There is actually very recently a conversation that says actually we should start the clock of the origins of the US in 1619, which is when enslaved Africans were introduced as part of English settlement. I personally look to further back to 1526, which is actually before the English came and set up a permanent settlement. The Spanish tried to. And they did so bringing enslaved Africans. And the experiment failed. This is why, you know, English is the official language here and not Spanish. The experiment failed because there was a joint rebellion of the enslaved Africans and the indigenous people. And the Africans ran and, you know, they kicked out the Spanish, they joined the indigenous people and they lived together. And it sets this example of it is actually possible to share this place in a way that is not rooted in domination, but actually in solidarity. I mean, it began with a revolt. And that is a lineage that I claim and hope to honor. So the other thing is the way that US capitalism has been structured has tended to bind the fate of Black people and indigenous people. Not that we have the same exact experience, because there's an experience of dispossession and an ongoing colonizing war against the native people that continues to this day. It's different from the Black people who, it's like native people were excluded from this project, whereas Black people were incorporated, but in a way that we were at the bottom of the project, right? In this, as enslaved people. But nonetheless, we were bound together because actually when the country was being, the United States was constituted, and as it was expanded, there was a constant debate in Washington about how to get more land and whether each additional state should have slavery or not. And there were these people who founded the country, the founding fathers talked about how actually we can deal with slavery by expanding, by taking more land. And it meant that the dispossession of native people and the enslavement of Black people was bound together. So, you know, this I think sets, I don't know, a pattern for the history of this place. There have been moments where Black people are enlisted in the settlement in a very particular way as soldiers, for example, in the conquest of the continent. And at the same time, Black people have largely been excluded from the whole of the settlement project because it is considered a white settlement project. So this is the complicated position that we're in. But I think the point here is that there is a rich history of solidarity between Black and indigenous people against the whole system, and it has only benefited, you know, our communities together. And a very contemporary example, this year, there is this huge nationwide Black-led uprising against racism that was sparked by the murders of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by the police. And it was enormous and very powerful in its impact on the conversation around policing. But it also actually was a context for the advancement of indigenous struggle as well. There are we have these sports teams, professional sports teams that are named after these like caricatures to mock indigenous people. And this year there was a new conversation. I mean, for years and decades, indigenous people have said this is not acceptable, you know. But this year there was that conversation entered a new level. And actually, Washington, D.C., which is where Leah lives and where I used to live, had, you know, this awful mascot attacking Native people. And this year it changed. And that was in the context of the Black-led revolt. So it's an example of how actually when this is true historically, when Native people and Black people fight, it benefits each of us. And actually, I would argue the whole society. And I will end on that point that, you know, even for those who are allowed to enjoy more of the fullness of the settlement project, there are problems that colonization produces problems for all of us, actually. You think about, for example, climate change. I mean, there's a catastrophe of the planet's ecology, and colonization is part of it. Colonization destroys the planet's ecology, and the energy that is devoted to continuing state violence, it means that we are not addressing this problem that all of us face. I mean, I think about like Israel forcing every generation and every future generation to be in military service, to, you know, imprison Palestinians, to run these checkpoints. You know, these people who are incarcerated, Palestinians who are incarcerated, first of all, of course, deserve to be free just because everybody deserves to be free. But also the incarcerated Palestinians in Palestine, the hundreds of thousands of incarcerated Black people in this country can be part, like, there are people in prison who have ideas on how to solve climate change, right? Right? Like, and actually, like, Indigenous people, of course, are leading the way, and we need Indigenous people all over the world to show all of us how to live in ways that work with the planet, right? So it really does take all of us down. The last thing, it's a bit, it gets at where Orly started, and it's a bit, it's political, but it's also a bit spiritual. It really actually degrades the humanity, not only of the colonized, but of the colonizer. Do you know what I mean? Like, one of the things I think about when I think about US empire is not only what the US militarization, what it means for Afghans and, you know, Iraqis and Palestinians, but what does it do to this place to be at war forever? And I ask people in Palestine to, of course, have our solidarity first and foremost with Palestinians who deserve liberation, and you know, but also to ask the question, what does it do to Israelis, actually? What does it do to your humanity to commit forever to subjugating another group of people? You know, and so, you know, I was looking at James Baldwin actually in preparation for this, because he writes beautifully about how Black liberation is for Black people, but it actually is also about finding the humanity of white people too. So to consider.
Thank you, Khoury. I didn't stop you on time because obviously I'm enjoying listening to this, but I
Sorry,
think
I'll be more brief.
One of the most important, I think, points that we need to think of along the way when we actually start collaborating more and working together more is really how solidarity highlights every struggle and not only the one we're trying to stand in solidarity with. But I think another important question is how do we decolonize people's minds in a way that they understand we are actually liberating them as colonizers as well, not only as colonized. But this is a very important point that I think we need to tackle more in our tactics and ways of working. Moving on to the second question, we will start with Orly, I guess now, if it's okay. When we see solidarity is in action, what does it require from you, and how has it looked between different communities committed to return and other forms of reparations?
Another very good question. You know, when you are part of the oppressing hegemony, the first thing that solidarity teaches you is modesty, which is a wonderful, I think, quality for all of us. The first thing really is to be modest, to not only recognize your part in the system, but acknowledging that this, acknowledging the leadership, the Palestinian leadership in this case, is the first thing for me. You know, in the so-called Zionist left, whatever is left of it today, they many times like to speak about Jewish-Arab partnership and Jewish-Arab whatever. It's always Jewish before the Arab, always. And it is always assumed automatically to be under Jewish leadership, because if Jews don't lead it, then it's not worth joining. I am a political activist within the Palestinian Party of Tajammu, Balad, which is the Palestinian Democratic National Alliance. And I think that, you know, it taught me so much, not just about, it's not, very soon I learned that it's not the Palestinians who need my solidarity, it's me who need their um, um, not approval, but giving me a political house and a place that I can, you know, feel that is meaningful to me. It required a lot. It required learning Arabic, which is, again, you know, sometimes we like to speak about solidarity in big words and big, but so unfortunately, and really I'm saying it with great sadness, so little Jewish leftists bother to actually learn Arabic and to communicate with their Palestinian friends in Arabic, or just learn the native language of the land. It's and of course you learn about so much more through language than just the communication between people. Um, Also, another part of the manifestation of this solidarity is to exercise your privileges as part of the oppressing hegemony wherever you can. Now, of course, I know that me as a Jewish Israeli, I have excessively more privileges than my Palestinian friends, including the Palestinian citizens inside Israel. Things that they would be imprisoned for, or certainly be called for interrogation at the police station or whatever, I can still say pretty freely. So to exercise those privileges, to stand up and speak about supporting the BDS, for Palestinians, it would immediately be translated into being accused of anti-Semitism today. And we see more and more that horrifying trend of identifying support of BDS as a form of anti-Semitism, which is really a disgrace to the memory of the Holocaust, and it's just shameful and disgraceful. So it's our job as Jews to make that distinction and to stand up and as loudly as we can support our Palestinian-led initiatives, struggles, etc. Going to demonstrations, this is, it sounds almost for granted, but there are places that the mere existence, presence of Jews would lessen significantly the chance that the soldiers would shoot to kill, and they do that in exclusively Palestinian demonstrations. We don't forsake the Palestinians to fight their fight alone. I think that this is how, and we exercise our privileges. We speak about the Nakba, which is, you know, with the Nakba law, and and other policies that the Israeli government for years have been promoting, even to admit that there is another history to that place. There, you know, it's being outlawed slowly, gradually in Israel. It's in and it's being done in our name, the Jewish community. So you know, to speak up and giving acknowledgement and presence to the Nakba, to the Palestinian history, etc. It's and I will briefly address your part of the question about the different groups. You know, Zionism has done such an amazing job in dividing groups, in dividing the society here, the fabric of society, into segregated, isolated pieces, and to incite them against one another, so that, you know, the Mizrahi is fighting the Ethiopian, and the Ethiopian is shooting at the Palestinian, and so I'm going back to the previous part of our conversation. I think that the way is always exposing the common roots of injustice and discrimination and racism, because it is always, you know, that concept of Zionism has about itself as a villa in the jungle, and many of the Zionist leaders described Israel as a villa in the jungle, and I would argue that this is a white villa in the jungle. It's when you look inside that imaginary villa, you see how everybody is being being restricted to their own cubicle or to their own, you know, face. So breaking those walls inside the villa and the walls of the external walls of the villa altogether, and to reconnecting to the area, etc. That's the biggest project. But honestly saying, it's a huge challenge. There are some examples that you can see how that solidarity is being is raised from bottom up. For example, the struggle now around the Asi River up north, which it's a kibbutz, it's a white Ashkenazi kibbutz that excludes the Mizrahim from access to the river that passes through their territory. And all of a sudden, those Mizrahim, and they come mostly from right-wing houses, politically, etc. They slowly understand that these are the same people who excluded the Palestinians and put the fences there to begin with, to steal the land from the Palestinians. And all of a sudden, you can see a different dialogue between those young Mizrahim and the Palestinians. So those are little places that give hope, but the bigger picture is still, unfortunately, quite gloomy.
Thank you, Orly. Yeah, I think it's very important to start at least using these opportunities of internal divisions and internal struggles to actually highlight the rooted problem and bring it closer to the root problem of the colonization and the Palestinians and the Nakba. So I think this is an important thing to do inside the demonstrations and you know, any kind of struggle that is happening on the ground. Khoury, we will continue with you with this question.
Sure. So, well, the first thing I just want to emphasize, like, how eager I am to see the day when Palestinians have achieved the right of return. I mean, like, it's hard to express what that would mean in terms of not only transforming the place of Palestine, transforming the Palestinian community. And because of and that in itself is tremendous. Like just the injustice of millions of people prevented from accessing their home is one of the great injustices of our time, and it needs to end, and it will end. I think sooner than we may think. But for what it's worth, when that ends, it will be such a radical transformation, actually. And you know, Israel plays this very important role in a global structure of colonization and militarization and domination, that when Palestinians actually get free, that will have implications for people everywhere. You know, the role that the Israeli weapons industry, for example, plays, the Israeli state plays in arming the governments around the world, repressing people where they are, will be diminished, if not ended, by Palestinian liberation. So, so I just think that's incredibly important for, first of all, for Palestinians, but secondly, for humanity. Another point, I just want to do what in here in Black America, what we call a shout out, which is kind of amplifying something. I want to shout out this year especially, there are these amazing campaigns led by Indigenous people here under the phrase land back, like we want the land back. There's these incredible campaigns that call for returning the land to Native people in general, but also for particular places. There are like particularly like sacred sites that there are campaigns to win. And again, this would be transformative in terms of, you know, allowing for liberation and sovereignty for people who have been besieged for 500 years. And also this will it'll have impact for the planet's ecology and for humanity, because, for example, the asserting the native right to return and right of sovereignty in here in North America has been coupled with the question of building these oil pipelines, which are disastrous for the environment, which continues to have fossil fuels at the center of the world economy. And so like this will like, it'll be very important for Native people, but it will be a win for all of humanity and for the ecology of this planet when Native folks have control of their land, have access to their land, are back on their land. And then the last point, you know, I think that this is this time that we are in is really just a time of a global crisis of displacement of many groups of people from many different places. Just to say a word about what's happening in the US and in Black America, there's not enough of a conversation about it, but there is an enormous shift of the geography and social reality of Black America right now. For example, you know, Washington, DC, again, where Leah lives, where I lived until recently, this used to be a majority Black city, and that's not true anymore. And this is the case for all of these cities that are known all over the world because of their cultural significance. You know, cities and neighborhoods: Brooklyn, Harlem, Chicago, Oakland, New Orleans. You know, these what Black people have played such a critical role in making these places what they are. And of course, it has meant something for us in our society, in our culture. And it's a catastrophe, actually, what's happening. So what it would mean, for example, that my family, you know, we trace the center of our world is Brooklyn, you know, and there's a neighborhood that used to have the highest concentration of Black people in the United States. This is where my family is from. And one by one, the members of my family lost their homes in this neighborhood. And now it's rapidly gentrifying. So what would it mean for us to be able to return? You know, of course, it's not the same as the dispossession of Palestinians or of Native Americans, but there's something that resonates with me. And then I just think about beyond this place, you know, refugees who are being displaced by war, by climate change, by economic disaster. And of course, you know, especially living in this place in the United States, I want to fight for anybody who wants to come here, tear down the walls. If you want to come in, you're welcome. You know, I would suggest other places to live, but you're welcome to come here. But people also deserve to stay where they are, right? If they want to, and to return to where they've been displaced from. So this is, I think, the Palestinian right of return we can see in the context of fighting for many people's rights to return and against displacement.
Thank you, Khoury. And I think this is also something that we need to also relate to among Palestinians in Israel, that yeah, the main issue or the core issue is the refugees, but many of the Palestinians who are still living inside Israel, whether they are displaced or not, cannot also go back to their gentrified neighborhoods. If we look at Led, if we look at Yafa, if we look at many neighborhoods, what's happening in Akka and in Haifa, we see that many people can no longer live in their places or stay in their places due to the gentrification, which is part of the colonization. So, you know, it's like sometimes we don't know if we should call it gentrification, because it's actually just another way to displace Palestinians. And to be honest, even the cities, the Palestinians cities that still remain there with many natives and other people who came to it, suffer a lot from being inside their own city and reclaiming that city and feeling safe inside their own city. So I think returning and reclaiming your space where you are is also one way to look at return, not only the return of the refugees. Thank you, Khoury, for this. Moving on to Leah.
Thank you all. You got me like writing down a million connections, and I want to offer a framework and some more examples from what Khoury kind of pushed us into about what displacement looks like what do these structures look like, and then I want to also offer some examples for white Jewish Americans, or at least spoke so beautifully for Jews in Israel, what rescinding privilege looks like. So I have a few ideas for white Jewish Americans, and I want to close with one piece we haven't talked about as much yet, which is the baseline work of transforming yourself to be able to participate in these movements. So for starters, everything we're talking about reminds me of a great simple framework. I think I heard it from the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, AROC, AROC. This is a Palestinian-led organizing community group in the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland. And they talk about a framework. I don't know if they came up with it or where they got it from, but they talk about the right to return, the right to move, and the right to stay as being an interconnected demand. I think they sometimes also talk about the right to resist, which feels like integral to all three. So that if we're going to have a free and decolonized world, I love what Najwan said about, we need to decolonize people's minds to know we are liberating them as well. Like, the world I want to live in is where people can move away from threats, where people can stay in the neighborhoods they grew up in, where people can return to the neighborhoods they were displaced from. And that is just as true in Georgetown, DC, where a friend of mine, this is the whitest place in DC now, a friend of mine's, Black grandparents, I think, or maybe great grandparents, were displaced from there. Much like in Palestine, you have places in America where the presence of Black people has been attempted to be scrubbed clean, but it's people remember their grandparents' houses, right? So this is a global phenomena to have the right to these three things. And I think I want to speak a little bit towards, as white Jewish Americans, what power do we have to relinquish to really participate in this really visionary movement? And I mean, there's so many examples. I can't speak the most to it, but I'll say one idea is that, thinking about how we reckon with our relative access to Palestine has been a really important thing for me personally. And I'm remembering a really painful movement moment. It was 2 or 3 years ago. There was an interfaith delegation to Palestine. Many people were denied entry, including some white Jewish American rabbis who were very committed to the movement. And I think there was a collective failure I saw in my Palestine solidarity US movement to communicate with each other about how we talk about that. When white Jewish Americans are denied entry to Palestine, how can we do as best as possible to talk about how this is actually about repressing Palestinians? This is not about the targeting of white Jewish people. It's about putting us back in our lane as colonizers, but ultimately to continue the routine denial of the right to return for Palestinians. And again, it was a collective failure. I say I'm not pointing fingers at individuals because I think it was a collective failure to use that moment effectively to get shocked white American Jews who were not yet anti-Zionist to recognize that the denial of entry to a rabbi was about the repression of Palestinians. So that's one moment where that came up. And I also, Students for Justice in Palestine, the campus group, and also Jewish Folks for Peace on campus, I know has reckoned with this. And I had conversations about how can we use the relative privilege of white Jewish folks who will be constantly have a microphone in their face. Say, what do you think about the conflict? You know, it's a disgusting phenomenon. People want to know what I think about my friends' grandparents, you know, forcible displacement and extermination. And they think I know. I took one class in 6th grade, you know, about the Nakba. Was actually, that's rare actually to be a Jewish American who learned about the Nakba as a maybe 12-year-old, but it doesn't make me an expert. So to refuse that refusal and the rescinding of platform and privilege, that's why, you know, like I was glad to be part of this conversation, but I think I'm in a constant reflex about how can I be in communication about when someone else should be taking this space. And I'm always learning. And the last thing I wanted to share was, we talked about this, but we didn't name it. I loved Orly's bringing in poetry. I think we need poetry in the movement. And I want to share about how radical imagination is so key. And I did a Justice Project, and the US has done a beautiful job bringing this to the Palestine space. Black feminists have brought this to contemporary movements. And, you know, Black people enslaved by white people who saw the Haitian rebellion and imagined freedom, you know, did this many, many, many decades ago. So it's a long tradition. But I want to bring in one piece of a poem. There's a wonderful poet named Martin Espada. He has a poem called Imagine the Angels of Bread. My friend read this to me sitting on the floor when we headed into, I believe, 2017, and we're still very afraid of what was happening in America. And there's a last stanza that reads, if the abolition of slave manacles began as a vision of hands without manacles, manacles are like cups, you know, chains, then this is the year. And it talks about all these things. And they also say, if every rebellion begins with the idea that conquerors on horseback are not many-legged gods, that they too drown. If plunged in the river, then this is the year. And it just goes on how we need to both imagine what freedom looks like, and that helps us imagine how the colonizers will fall, just like Hari was saying, like we will see the right of return. So I'm thinking about that poetry and so many other poems. I love poems. Thank you, Orly. But with that in mind, what I wanted to share was, I think it's actually part of the work before we can even, you know, you could learn Arabic, but approach Palestinian people with a lack of humility that makes the relationship building project lost. So likewise, unless we've imagined and started to enact, Grace Lee Boggs is my favorite person in the United States history who's talked about this. Many more have, where she talks about we need to transform ourselves to transform the world. Until we know how to act with each other, where we base power on trust instead of domination, we will not be able to build a world where there's no more colonialism, right? So, and just to close by saying that as a white American sitting in literally the heart of empire, socialized into like the world is your oyster, like save the Black and brown people, very toxic socialization. I have the most humility I need to kind of gain, the modesty Orly talked about. And I think I have to do the most of my own work to kind of undo the brainwashing and instead relearn and listen and see what people are imagining and creating. Because until we know how to be with each other, we will only reproduce, you know, I'll close with some Grace Lee Boggs thought. She said people had whole revolutions where they created states that were new versions of the states they opposed. This has happened millions of times. So the only way we're going to get to the world we want is by actually creating new practices in our communities between each other. And then we build from there a new vision for what safety looks like, a new vision for what a world where we can all stay and return and move looks like, it requires us to do that internal work and that imagining, and poetry gets us there and relationship building gets us there.
Thank you, Leah. When you spoke about the the expert of the Nakba, you know, this is another point that is very important, is how to get informed, what kind of narrative to use and who should actually say that narrative. And I think this is a very important point that you've made. And when it comes to radical imagination, I think many are imagining the future of Palestinians without the Palestinians. And I think the radical imagination even started in English for Palestinians. So this is an important point that also links with the language. And I think, this is something that needs to be discussed further, probably mostly in the US, but also among Israelis as well. Okay, so moving on to our last question for this panel before we move to the Q&A, if I actually let you go after this question. My last question, I would start with Khoury, I think. How can we build a global movement of progressive and revolutionary groups to advance return? And please feel free to think of return in any way you want.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, in our last round of questions and answers, we got to talk a bit about what we mean by return, and I think that having that expansive view is very important. And so, for me, solidarity is fundamentally, it's identifying the linkages that bind us together, that are there whether we see them or not. And the nature of global capitalism, imperialism, is that many people and states and entities are bound together. Not all in the same way. It doesn't mean that we're all bound to the system in the same exact ways, but we're bound. And the thing is, the states know this. I mean, this is why the Israel and US collaborate so extensively. They're very clear. And so the challenge for activists is always, can we help reveal the same level of clarity? And I say this, with heaviness, that there is the potential for many people in the world to connect with the experience of Palestinians, because there are so many horrific examples of displacement and oppression. And so I think that's part of what we have to do, is looking for those linkages. And if you start with the starting point that they exist, then you see them and they're kind of difficult to avoid. And then the challenge is building out the resistance. So I'll end on that point, that there are, what's really good about the good thing about oppression is that it's being challenged everywhere. But often, or too often, we don't know who our organic allies are who are challenging similar systems, often the same exact companies. Elbit Systems, this Israeli company that perfected the control of the movement of human beings in Palestine, is now part of the US-Mexico border, right? So Central Americans and Mexicans who are migrating over that border may not know that the same company that's targeting them was developed against Palestinians, but it was. And so how can we make these connections? And not in a superficial way, in a genuine way that honors the real organic rootedness. And that means the kind of listening, the kind of humility that Orly and Leah have talked about is really important. And I think that we will have a much richer, fuller resistance when we do that.
Thank you, Khoury. Orly, are you ready to answer that question?
Yeah, well, first I must say that, I wish we had the formula to form that much needed global movement that would, few thoughts. First, I think, I think that to deal with a problem, or to try, or in order to even imagine possible solutions or ways out of it, you need to go back to the root. And the root, it's people. First of all, everybody in the world has an opinion about the conflict, which is the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is basically the occupation and colonialization of Palestine by Israel. But they always refer to the 67 lines. And so I think the first task to bring that global understanding and to jumpstart a global movement or to enhance it is to change terminology. I mean, it's not a conflict, it's a colonization. It doesn't start in 67, it starts in 48, and each time taking it back to the root. Terminology matters. I work with words, so for me words matter. And one of the terminologies that I think need to be changed in our using is shifting from a discourse of peace into justice. I mean, we don't demand peace, we demand justice, because demanding peace only takes us to those bypass ridiculous deals, which are basically armed deals with the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and so on. So we call it peace agreements, and we are supposed to be celebrating it, but it's basically a manipulative arm deal in order to bypass the Palestinian case. So we should start, and again, the change should start with us here. We should stop talking about peace and start talking about justice. This is what we demand, and really targeting the groups that that they are stockholders in that case, maybe even against their own knowledge or even against their own will. And I'm speaking about Jewish communities around the world. I mean, the horrors that are being done against Palestinians here in Palestine, Israel is explicitly and officially doing it in the name of, worldwide Jewry. And I think that today, actually, it's an interesting time around the world, because I think that more and more communities, minority communities, especially around the world, come to the understanding that it cannot be just about power. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump and the neo-anti-Semitism that he is really encouraging in the US now, so I'm thinking American Jewry must understand that it cannot be about power and only power, that power is not equal to morality, not in the Trump United States and not in Zionist Israel, and that it is being done in their names as well. And so even if it's against their will, they are stockholders and they must speak out against it. So I would, I mean, and that's my, very narrow frame of but I think that, there is a wonderful project that I had the privilege to be a part of at its early stages that is called Who Profits from the Occupation. It's a website that actually called Who Profits from the Occupation. with lists of the different companies invested in the Israeli occupation, to take it to local activists around the world, encouraging them to go to have a look at that list, identify the companies from their own native countries that are, you know, investing and profiting from the occupation, and promote local campaigns against those companies, to understand that the world has an active part and share in the oppression of the Palestinian people, and that they don't have just the right, they have they are obligated to first know. Information is hugely important in that global vision, and to act. So just to sum it up in one sentence, to, you know, turn, if we are holding a flashlight and it's constantly directed at us, to turn the flashlight and direct the light at those who enjoy, who profit from the oppression of the Palestinians, who are an active part of it, to their governments, to their companies, etc., and demand that change.
Thank you, Orly. I think this connects very much to also what Khoury said, you know, about Elbit system and other corporations. I think I'm also very close to Who Profits organization. I think this organization have taught me a lot on how to really become political consumers. And I think this is one of the ways that we need to also highlight in our movements, is that consumption is also a political choice and a moral choice, and being aware of that. And I think not many people work on actually making this information accessible. And I think we need to work more on highlighting the kind of companies that are complicit in the occupation, to be more aware of the way we consume things, like consuming Dubai, for example, for now. So we will end with Leah.
Thank you all. You brought so much richness. I'll try to be short, but I'm sitting with, I think maybe a way to summarize the political piece of this, and I'll talk about the personal piece, is that colonialism has been a project of peace without justice for hundreds and thousands of years, right? It is the attempt to come in violently to a place, to take land and space, to crush the indigenous resistance, often armed, and to create peace on the remnants of homes and lands and cultures and languages, right? So this piece that both my co-panelists have brought up about insisting that there is no peace until justice, or no justice, no peace, as we say very often in US movements, especially Black-led racial justice movements, that is really key. And just to offer some of what that means, it definitely means we reject funding, like we boycott companies that profit from occupations, but it also means we stop the funding, like stop our tax dollars from funding violent systems. And so, you know, fighting or resisting peace without justice just as much means rejecting the right wing as it means this kind of, in the US, I would say, complicit center of liberalism. And we see this in all movements that are demanding transformation. So what I mean is that if we're going to have the right to return and a world of justice for everyone, you know, AIPAC is a problem, but so is J Street, right? Which is the US kind of liberal Zionist lobby that attempts to create peace without justice. Exactly. They will support investigations and limited reform so long as it doesn't overturn Jewish supremacy and, you know, allow Palestinians to return to their homes. That would be untouchable. Or listen to Palestinians who are not complicit in a liberal vision. So it means J Street isn't welcome in our spaces. And it equally means that a group like, I'll give an example, Campaign Zero isn't welcome in our spaces. This is kind of a faux racial justice push to reduce the killing of Black people by police rather than eliminate it by defunding the harmful system. And so this idea of transformation, of radical change over reform means that in our own spaces, we think about how can we always demand more of ourselves to be really getting to the root and transforming. And it fundamentally, I think it always comes back to this idea of we are creating justice so that a peace we can all live in follows, and we are rejecting peace without justice. And I also want to say, again, to close on this, what personal transformation does this require? I think that, I sat a couple of years ago across a table from a wonderful comrade named Dominic Molden, who used to be with a group called 1DC that fights displacement, led by Black communities in DC. And he said basically, when are we going to fight for the right for Black Americans to return to DC? And I think that is a really beautiful possibility for supporting, especially as like non-Black and non-Palestinian co-conspirators, to support the justice visions of our comrades, is to say, oh yes, let's talk about the right to return, not only for Palestinians, not only for people who can reference international law, but also people who don't have laws and titles and things because of systems like slavery and white supremacy in America, but who have equal kind of right. And then likewise with indigenous people of this nation, and reckoning with what that will require for our giving up our privileges and lands, and relearning how we even talk about this land, to say that there is a right to return for the Piscataway people to the occupied land that I am on. And I think that starts with personal work to pivot from kind of dominance to humility and coercion to trust in how like I move through the world as a white person in radical movements. So it's definitely my hope is to really embody peace with justice and how I move through space, and that's a constant process.
Notice that I'm muted. Thank you. We will move to the Q&A session. We have some questions in the Q&A, and we have other questions from Facebook Live. We will try to take only very few questions because we're almost out of time. So I will start with a question to Orly from Harold. Mizrahi has always seemed to me to be a Zionist construct. No one outside of Israel is Mizrahi. What have Iranians and Iraqis got in common with Moroccans apart from being labeled as Mizrahi?
Wonderful, wonderful question. The short answer would be the main thing that we have in common. It's absolutely true. You're absolutely right. It's an Israeli invention. And the thing that I, as an Iranian, have in common with a Moroccan and an Iraqi is the mechanism of discrimination and cultural elimination that were imposed upon both of us, the three of us, by the same source. It's true. I mean, having said that, I do want to say that your existence always can contain different and sometimes contradictory identities, which goes from the very personal. I am a mother, my occupational identity, my Jewish identity, my Israeli identity, but also my regional identity. And I think that being, for me, it means something. It means something that I am, before I was locked inside that colonial structure, I was a native of the region. And I think that at least my Mizrahi political activism, which I share with dear friends from different Muslim countries, from Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, etc. This is what we have in common: the shared desire to reconnect to the region as proud natives and not as colonizers, because we have been there, we have experience, we have that experience in our history, not to be colonizers in that region. And I think that it's a significant common denominator between us.
Thank you, Orly. A question from Facebook to Khoury. You said that right to return will diminish Israeli arms industry. Can you explain how?
Yeah, I just think that if Palestinians win the right of return, I don't see how Israel could continue being what it has been. I mean, that would require pretty fundamental transformation of the country. I mean, I think that if the point of Israel is to be a Jewish state, and then therefore built into the whole structure is the privileging of Jews at the exclusion of Palestinians, primarily, but that by embracing that colonial project, it then embeds the Israeli state in a particular kind of naked way in global colonization. You know, Palestinian liberation is the linchpin that undoes that. So just a word about when I say that you know, I talk about the kind of Israeli place in world imperialism. You know, of course, colonization happens all over the world, including very much in this place called the United States. Israel, you know, the fact that Israelis refer to themselves as settlers in settlements, this is like, you know, I'm always, I say this with respect, but I'm always struck by the lack of self-awareness of Israelis, with how this like lands on people outside of Israel. And so it's clear for those of us paying attention, you know, and I say this as somebody who inhabits the United States. I know that Americans are totally lacking self-awareness, but there's a self-conscious role that the Israeli state plays, and it enlists Israeli citizens in playing this militarizing role all around the world. So I just think that Palestinian freedom will undo that whole project.
Thank you, Khoury. We have a question for Leah. Wait, I lost the question. Sorry. You said solidarity. No, this is for, I'm sorry, for Orly, but it also refers to Leah. You said that solidarity for you is to reconnect with Palestinians as a native of the Middle East and renouncing your colonial privileges. The question is, how would you advise an Ashkenazi anti-Zionist citizen of Israel to carry out their act of solidarity? This also goes for you, Lee. The question is, how do you advise less privileged white Jews to carry out their act of solidarity in the States?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
I'll be short because I think you have such a beautiful way of speaking towards this. I don't want to take up your time, but sometimes refusal requires no money and little time. To simply not go on birthright takes no time at all. I mean this seriously, right? Like, some people are like, how do we show up in solidarity? It's like, you know, it doesn't cost money to not buy SodaStream. It doesn't cost money time to not attend birthright. It doesn't actually cost resources that those of us who are working class, who are Black and brown, who are disabled, who have understandable barriers to participate in our social justice movements that need to be more inclusive, it often costs nothing at all to simply not participate and refuse. And then I think it's also on us to find and create the space to do the internal work, to do the coalition work, and to show up. But yeah, I would start to say that, like, to not cause harm usually just takes self-reflection and not necessarily access to resources. And in that way, thinking about the founders of Mihante wrote a beautiful article. It's called something like "We Found Love in a Hopeless Place" or something. And they talk about how they had a wealth of aligned values and people, even as they had a lack of monetary resources and political power, and that from that wealth, they built power. So I would say to build power from the wealth of alignment and vision and commitment, and to not be hindered by our lack of resources for those for whom that applies.
Thank you, Lee.
Believe it or not, I actually wrote once a guideline for Ashkenazis. Honestly, I published it. who wants to participate in the Mizrahi struggle. But I think that many of those advices apply also to the Palestinian case for Ashkenazis, and I'll just mention a few of them. First, I think that, you know, the fact that you do call yourself Ashkenazi, this is important because, you know, in the Israeli discourse, you have a name for everybody except for the Ashkenaz, like you have the Ethiopians, and you have the Russians, and you have the Mizrahim, and you have the Palestinians. And the transparent hegemony is just that doesn't, you know, it's the for granted, it's the given. So don't be transparent about your identity. Your identity means something. It means also, by the way, it means that you also paid a price in this Zionist project of eliminating the Jewish original traditions and cultures to create this weird creature of the Sabra, of the Israeli born with no past, no history. And so reclaim yours, but know your place in the hierarchy of power. And remember that it's not about you, because very often I find it much more frustrating to have a political discussion with an Ashkenazi lefty than with a Mizrahi right-winger, because it immediately becomes very personal. Like, you know, I speak about the discrimination or the racism of the Ashkenazi establishment in the 50s. And there will always be an Ashkenazi saying, oh, but my grandfather, you know, didn't do that. But yeah, but it's not a person, you know your place and for that, it's important to recognize that you too belong to a certain group with color and with identity and with a very specific collective place and role in the hierarchy of power. So I think that acknowledging that would be a huge, step forward into being able to really, truly put your privileges aside or acknowledging them, and in the attempt to join a joint struggle. It's like I would never tell a Palestinian, oh, but I didn't go to the army, or I didn't send my daughters to the army, so I'm the good Jew. No, I'm part of the oppressing power, and I need. It's not a game of blame or shame. It is a matter of acknowledgement and responsibility and accountability. And I think that would be a really good place for the Ashkenazis to start on their way to that struggle for different future.
Thank you, Orly. We'll take a last question to Lee. You emphasize that you are Jewish. What does that really mean? Blood, religion, sentiment, habit? Please don't say culture. Why is Jewishness so central to your identity?
Thank you for this question. I think the beauty of Judaism is that it is more than religion, but also a culture, and also often subculture of places spanning from Morocco to India to Jerusalem, where you do have Jewish roots. And I think the other beauty of it is that we each get to define it. I am part of building the world I want is where, and maybe this question is gesturing at this, is where we no longer base access to power on these narrow categories. So we no longer have to defend them with this violence, whether it be physical violence or kind of a cultural violence of excluding, for instance, American Jews who have a father who is Jewish. These kind of violences in our society are rooted in a narrow definition of how we connect to culture. I think for me, Judaism is something passed down by one of my parents, but I think it's more importantly a noticing the ways in which we're actively choosing to return to some of the ways that our ancestors lived many hundreds of years ago and rejecting others. So it's a new Jewish tradition. So, I feel most Jewish when I sing the contemporary Jewish liberation canon. There's a beautiful set of contemporary protest songs that connect to this tradition. And I feel most Jewish when I think about diaspora, right? Which is this idea that there's something very beautiful and somewhat unique, definitely not only to Jews, but somewhat unique with Jewish people in terms of the idea that we are not less Jewish when we are surrounded by people of other experiences. And it feels echoed by my mother, who does not feel any less Jewish when she goes to a mosque or a church, as someone who works in actually like interfaith organizing and resistance, and now also Palestine solidarity. So I think to me it is some very specific traditions, but it is also more so an insistence on connecting with our ancestors in a way that is not narrow and is not and that is instead kind of expansive, and that, you know, I'm very much a US Jew, right, which ties me up with so many histories, beautiful and resistant and also violent, and that's how I arrive here, and it's something I bring. So I think for me, it's definitely more than a religion, and I think by breaking open and liberating ourselves from these stories, these myths told by states, such as the myth Zionism that the Israeli and US state tell, we liberate ourselves from these myths and we can connect to something that is more about what we learned from our parents and what they learned from their great-great-grandparents, and that's much more powerful.
Thank you, Leah. I think we will stop here because it's almost 8:30 in Palestine. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this talk and for your amazing contributions. I think you've said so many great points that I would find it difficult to summarize, especially that I was also being engaged with you. But I think one of the most important issues to understand about this talk, for us at least, or for me as a Palestinian as well, that this is an invitation to talk, to start talking, to start working together, to start collaborating more together. I think looking back, I mean, Orly and all of you said that we need to look at the root of the problem, and the root of the problems takes us to the the rooted solutions, and the solution should tackle these problems. And I think we are at a point that we've all reached an understanding that we need to take this to a further level, to a step further, and we need to start working toward return rather than just adapting to the new realities that will keep coming up along the way from the Israeli occupation, or from the American government, or everywhere. And I think, as Khoury said, there are oppressions being challenged everywhere. And I think it's important to understand that these oppressions are all linked, and we need to identify these linkages. And this takes a lot of work, but I think this will get us somewhere. And I think this is where we wanted to end this year, to say that we need to identify these linkages. We need to also know that, even for me as a Palestinian, when I talk about solidarity, I don't only look into solidarity with Palestine. When I look into solidarity, I also think, how can this solidarity help me stand for other struggles, and how can I be helpful in highlighting what's happening elsewhere, not only for my own benefit as a Palestinian or for my liberation, because I truly believe that the liberation of Palestinians will lead to the liberation of all people around the world. And I think, because as you said, Khoury, we will have a different system. When we have return, the system will be different. We will look at things differently. We will have a decolonized land, and hopefully decolonized minds. And I think this is the beginning of something great. And I do hope that in the coming year, we will engage in more talks about this topic with other activists and movements, and we will host more people from indigenous communities around the world, not only the states, but other communities. And I really want to thank you for this rich conversation. Thank you, Orly, thank you, Khoury, and thank you, Leah. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I hope we will be in touch soon. I also just want to ask some of you to send whatever resource you've mentioned, and we can send it to the list of attendees. I want to thank all the participants in here and who watched us online, and we will be also sharing it in our newsletter. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Najwan.
Thank you so much, Najwan.
Thank you.